October 27, 1962. A Soviet submarine called B-59 is being hunted beneath the Atlantic by an American anti-submarine group. The crew is exhausted. The batteries are nearly empty. The air is hot and foul. Small signaling charges keep exploding in the water around the hull. The Americans intend those charges to force the submarine to surface. But inside B-59, the crew cannot be sure that is what they are. They have been out of reliable contact with Moscow. Their captain, Valentin Savitsky, begins to believe that war may already have started, and B-59 is carrying something the Americans do not know about: a nuclear torpedo. In recorded history, that weapon stayed in its tube. Savitsky was eventually persuaded to surface, and B-59 rose into a world that, somehow, was still at peace. But the margin was thinner than the outcome makes it look. Inside the submarine, no one can see the whole crisis. There is heat, bad air, failing batteries, silence from Moscow, and explosions in the water above. Savitsky has to decide what those fragments mean. If his belief that war has already begun holds for just a little longer, the argument that restrained him never wins out. The order is given. A nuclear torpedo heads toward the American anti-submarine group, with the carrier, Randolph, nearby. Seconds later, the question at the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis changes. Until now, Kennedy and Khrushchev have been trying to prevent a nuclear war. Now they have to decide whether one has already begun. That still does not make every missile in the United States and Soviet Union launch automatically. Washington has choices. Moscow has choices. Commanders below them still have incomplete information. And that is what makes the next few hours so dangerous. The first nuclear explosion does not decide the war. It forces everyone else to decide what the explosion means. By then, the crisis is already at its worst point. American nuclear forces are at defense condition 2, one step below general war. Soviet missile sites in Cuba are reaching operational readiness. That same day, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane is shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot. Another U-2 accidentally flies into Soviet airspace near Siberia. In Washington, President John Kennedy is still trying to find a deal with Nikita Khrushchev. At the same time, the United States has prepared plans for airstrikes and an invasion of Cuba. Then a nuclear weapon explodes at sea. Washington does not immediately know whether the order came from Moscow, from Cuba, or from one frightened submarine captain. There is no modern crisis hotline between the White House and the Kremlin yet. There are only messages, ambassadors, military reports, and assumptions. Kennedy now has to make a decision while American sailors are dead and Soviet missiles are still sitting in Cuba. The most dramatic response would be an immediate nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. But that is not the most plausible first move. Kennedy had spent the crisis resisting advisors who wanted faster military action. Even after an American U-2 was destroyed, he did not instantly order an attack. Kennedy's behavior during the real crisis suggests he would still look for one boundary he could hold. The Soviet Union has used a nuclear weapon. The United States will respond militarily, but not, at least yet, by attacking Soviet cities. That makes Cuba the likeliest first target. Soviet missile sites, air defenses, and military positions on the island. Even that is a massive escalation. And it creates a problem American planners do not fully understand. There are more nuclear weapons on Cuba than Washington knows. The United States knows about the ballistic missiles. It does not know the full scale of the Soviet tactical nuclear arsenal on the island. Those weapons were meant for a battlefield much smaller than the Soviet Union or the United States. An invasion beach, a naval base, a troop concentration. Exactly the kind of targets an American attack would now create. Airstrikes alone also cannot guarantee that every missile has been destroyed. That was one of the reasons American military planning had linked air attack to an invasion. If those first strikes cannot guarantee the missiles are gone, pressure to send troops onto Cuba grows quickly. Kennedy has bought hours, not peace. Now Khrushchev faces the same nightmare from the other side. A Soviet submarine has fired a nuclear weapon without solving the crisis. American aircraft are attacking Soviet forces. Communication with units on Cuba is chaotic. And Moscow has to decide whether this is punishment, the beginning of an invasion, or the opening phase of a larger American attack. This is the first real chance to stop the war. Khrushchev could announce that the submarine acted without authorization, order the missiles dismantled, and accept almost any deal Kennedy offers. Kennedy could pause the attack long enough to test that claim. Both men historically showed that they feared losing control of the crisis. But after a nuclear detonation and American retaliation, accepting restraint becomes politically and militarily harder for both of them. If neither side takes that exit, the next American step becomes harder to avoid. Troops begin landing on Cuba. The Soviet ground commander now has weapons capable of turning an invasion into a catastrophe. Their use would still require decisions and authorization. Nothing about this is automatic. But if Moscow believes the Cuban position is collapsing, one limited nuclear strike can begin to look like a way to stop the invasion without attacking the American homeland. Then the invasion runs into the danger Washington never fully understood was waiting on the island. A tactical nuclear weapon is used against an American military target on or near Cuba. The crisis changes again. The first nuclear explosion could still be explained as a submarine commander losing control. The second cannot be dismissed so easily. Kennedy is now being asked to restrain the United States after Soviet nuclear weapons have been used twice. A purely conventional response becomes much harder to defend. After Soviet nuclear weapons have been used twice, the pressure for a nuclear answer becomes far harder to contain. A limited American strike against Soviet forces in Cuba offers one terrible boundary Kennedy could still try to draw. Not Moscow, not Leningrad, not Soviet missile fields, Cuba. For a few hours, both governments might still tell themselves that the war is contained. That is the most dangerous illusion of all. Because a limited nuclear war creates new decisions faster than leaders can understand the last ones. American nuclear forces are already on extreme alert. Soviet forces have to assume that attacks on Cuba could be followed by attacks on the Soviet Union. European NATO countries have to prepare for the possibility that the war will move toward them. The Soviet Union has large numbers of shorter-range missiles positioned to threaten targets in Europe, and American nuclear weapons are already deployed across the alliance. At this point, one radar mistake, one unauthorized attack, one misunderstood bomber movement, or one commander acting too quickly can move the war out of Cuba. Berlin is an obvious pressure point. American intelligence had already considered the possibility that Moscow could answer pressure on Cuba by threatening access to West Berlin. In a nuclear crisis, even a conventional move there could be read as preparation for something larger. Turkey is another problem. American Jupiter nuclear missiles are based there, close to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev wants them removed as part of the deal that is still being negotiated, while B-59 is under the water. After nuclear weapons have already been used, those missiles no longer look like bargaining chips. They look like weapons that might launch. The longer the fighting continues, the more both sides face the same terrible incentive. Do not wait until the other side destroys the forces you may need. From here, the path to the familiar nightmare becomes frighteningly short. A Soviet strike on American bases in Europe. An American strike on Soviet missile forces. Then attacks on strategic targets. Then cities. Once the war crosses that line, predicting the exact sequence becomes almost meaningless. The United States had a major strategic advantage in 1962, but the Soviet Union still possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy cities across the United States and Europe. There is no version of a full exchange where one side meaningfully wins. But the war does not have to reach that point. There is a narrower possibility, and perhaps a more interesting one, Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to stop the escalation after nuclear weapons have already been used around Cuba. The island is devastated by invasion, bombing, and nuclear strikes, but strategic weapons never reach the two homelands. It would still be one of the worst events of the 20th century, but civilization survives, and the Cold War after 1962 becomes almost unrecognizable. The first change is political. In our history, the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced both governments that they needed better communication. A direct Washington to Moscow link followed. So did new momentum for arms control. After actual nuclear use, the pressure for those safeguards becomes overwhelming. But fear does not automatically create cooperation. The Soviet leadership could blame Khrushchev for allowing a disaster in Cuba. American leaders could conclude that restraint nearly got thousands of Americans killed. The result might be arms control and rearmament at the same time, better communication, more rules, and even more weapons in case those rules fail. The second change is the nuclear taboo. After 1945, nuclear weapons existed in enormous numbers, but governments treated actual use as a threshold that had not been crossed again. After nuclear use in 1962, that threshold no longer exists. Military planners now have a real example of nuclear weapons being used during a superpower crisis. That could make future leaders more frightened of escalation, or it could make limited nuclear use seem less impossible. Either way, every later Cold War crisis takes place in a world where the line has already been crossed. Vietnam, the Middle East, Berlin, the nuclear confrontations of the 1980s. All of them become more dangerous because nobody can say nuclear weapons are only theoretical. And there is one more consequence. The Cuban Missile Crisis no longer becomes a story about leaders approaching the edge and stepping back. It becomes a story about how little control they had. Once thousands of people, dozens of military units and weapons with different chains of command were all moving at the same time. And that is why B-59 matters. This path does not require Kennedy to suddenly become reckless. It does not require Khrushchev to decide that he wants a nuclear war. It does not require a missile computer to invent an attack that never happened. It only requires an exhausted submarine captain to hold his belief for a little longer, until the argument that restrained him no longer carries the room. So what if the Cuban Missile Crisis turned nuclear? The most plausible path is not that every missile launches 5 minutes later. The first explosion creates a series of smaller choices: retaliate or wait, strike Cuba or strike the Soviet Union, invade or negotiate, use one more nuclear weapon, or accept a military defeat. At every step, there is still a way out. The problem is that every explosion makes the next way out harder to choose. In our history, B-59 surfaced. Kennedy kept negotiating. Khrushchev accepted a deal. And on October 28th, the crisis began to end. With the torpedo fired, every decision that follows means something different. The Cold War does not turn nuclear because either side wants the world to end. It turns nuclear because both sides keep trying to prove that the last escalation will be the final one, and eventually, someone is wrong.